And if
Good
not,
morning. We'll try that again. Good morning. Welcome to Convocation 2023. My name is Alan Ewing Merrill, and I have the distinct pleasure to serve as the executive director here at the BTS Center and to work with a fine group of individuals whom you will meet over the course of these 2 days. And on behalf of our board of trustees, some of whom are here today, and our staff team, I'm so glad to welcome you to Convocation 2023. I cannot tell you how delighted I am to look out and see these faces in person. It's just wonderful after so many years of being apart to welcome you to this first in 3 years in-person convocation. At the same time, we're glad to welcome almost this same number of people who are logging in on Zoom this morning for what we're calling our online companions track. Yeah, let's give a wave. Our online companions track, and they're going to be with us for all the plenary sessions, maybe doing slightly different things when you all are in-person immersion sessions, their own kind of unique online experience. But through the magic of technology, we are one community over these 2 days. And we are thinking about kinship and reweaving the great web of belonging. So turn to a neighbor and just say, welcome to Convocation. But don't have a long conversation. And now turn in the other direction to another neighbor and say, I'm so glad you're here. So without further ado, I want to introduce our musician for these 2 days. Over here to my left, your right, Reverend Liz Fulmer, who's joining us from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So Liz is a queer pastor and musical storyteller serving on the pastoral team at Grandview Church in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, trained as a songwriter and a vocal principal at Berklee College of Music, and spiritually formed through the care and teaching of Lancaster Theological Seminary. Liz is passionate about facilitating divine encounter through the blending of breath, music, word, and community. She's a multi-instrumentalist. We'll see a little bit of that this week. She has recorded 3 albums of original music. Google Liz Fulmer. You can purchase your own music. And here's a story I want to tell you. This is a true story. A few years ago, Lady Gaga, you know Lady Gaga? Yeah. Visited the church where Liz served for a baptism on a Sunday morning. Liz said she had to learn to breathe after that. And after the service was over, Lady Gaga texted her and said, "You are sensational." Now, how many convocation musicians can say something like that? But we are going to discover that Liz is sensational over these 2 days. She says she feels called to the work of sacred space making, particularly for those who have been made to feel unworthy or unacceptable in the eyes of religious communities for any reason. So we're so glad to have Liz here. Let's do some singing.
I mean, I don't even know what to say after that. The bar is set up here. So let's shift our expectations. Because I see my role in these 2 days as a facilitator. So I might be standing in front of you, but we are creating music together. And for some people, that might be embracing the sound without necessarily joining in the singing. And that is certainly welcome there. So the first song we'll do is a meditation out of the Unitarian Church called Breathe In, Breathe Out on page 5 of your song books. And what's great about this song is there are so many different access points, especially for various vocal ranges. So what I'm hoping to do is create a choir out of those who are feeling brave enough to sing. And I will go through each line. If that line speaks to you or it's in your voice range, then you start singing. I'll move to the next line and the next folks will just join in organically and we'll see how that goes. If we're feeling like it's going really well, then I might even invite you to stand. But we'll stay seated for now, just as we're getting into this space. Here's the first one. Breathe in. Breathe out. Lower voices down here. Breathe in. Breathe out. It's breathe. Yeah. Breathe out. Breathe. Keep that going. Keep that going. Next line. Get above it. Breathe. Breathe. Breathe out. Breathe in. Here's another line. Breathe out. When I breathe in, keep it going, keep it going. I breathe out. When I breathe out, I breathe out. When I breathe in, I breathe out. When I breathe out, I breathe out. Another line above that. When I breathe in, I breathe out. When I breathe out, I breathe out. When I breathe in, yes, I breathe out. When I breathe out, I breathe out. Let's stand up. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. When I breathe in, I breathe out. When I breathe out, yes, I breathe out. Last time. When I breathe in, I breathe out. When I breathe out, I breathe out. Did you hear yourself? Okay. Wonderful. The next song is Piece of the Earth, which I know you've done in years past. Is there a way to get rid of that feedback? I don't want to blow anyone's ears out up front. Okay. This song also is page 1 of the songbook. Piece of the Earth. Now, everything works when you first plug it in, and then it will show up and everything changes. So we'll sing through this 3 times. The peace of the earth be with you, the peace of the heavens too. The peace of the rivers be with you, the peace of the oceans too. Deep peace falling over you. God's peace growing in you. Peace of the earth. The peace of the earth be with you. The peace of the heavens too. The peace of the rivers be with you. The peace of the oceans too. Deep peace falling over you.
Thank you all. Well, once again, I want to welcome you to Convocation 2023. There's a beautiful spirit that's filling this room, and I'm so grateful. As we gather here this morning and around the world through digital technology, we stand in a long line that traces its roots back to the year 1905. Somebody do some quick math. How many years ago was that? 118 years. The story goes that Dr. David Nelson Beach, who was the president of Bangor Theological Seminary, the predecessor organization to the BTS Center, was having a conversation with his wife, Dora Freeman Beach, and someone from the Congregational Missionary Society of Maine about the ways in which they could open up access to theological education so that it was accessible to more than just the current student body at the seminary, but that clergy and lay persons from around the state and even beyond the state could find a way to access and be inspired and educated. And so in that conversation, they cooked up the very first, convocation, which was held in 1905. And for 118 years, every year, except for a couple years during the Spanish flu in 1918 and 1919, they gathered for a convocation. At the very first convocation, or at the conclusion, a participant wrote to Dr. Beach, "I doubt if in any city in New England in the past 20 years, there has been gathered into 1 week so much of such value as these speakers have brought. This convocation ought to become permanent." Well, it kind of has, right? Because here we are 118 years later, and we are gathered in this place and in digital space for the 118th convocation. So there's a historic context to what we're doing today. And to be very clear, as we gather for convocation today, we are rooted and focused on the present and on the future. Paying attention to some of the most critically important issues of our day. We join a long line of faithful and prophetic leaders with our hearts and minds centered here and now, and our eyes oriented to the future. We're so glad you're here. I suspect that many of you at some point or another have encountered a land acknowledgement. And as we begin, we do want to pause for that moment. And I know there are different opinions about land acknowledgements. Sometimes they are critiqued, especially when they feel performative. But I do want to say that for the BTS Center, when we acknowledge the truth of our relationship with the land and its peoples, it's part of a broader intention to really be in right relationship and healing relationship with our Indigenous neighbors and to repair. And so we begin with a posture of honesty and self-reflection, acknowledging that so much of our collective history and prosperity are built on a foundation of colonialism, genocide, and slavery. That's just the truth, and we want to acknowledge that. So we gather today on the unceded lands of the Wabanaki Confederacy, the people of the Dawnland, the Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy tribes, who have stewarded this tract of earth, its forests, its rivers and lakes, its ocean waters and islands for 12,000, 15,000 years. We pause for a moment to acknowledge this truth and to acknowledge the repeated and ongoing violations of sovereignty, territory, and water perpetrated by settlers like my ancestors and like me that have impacted the original inhabitants of this land that have been colonized for the last, say, 400 years. May we mourn the grief created by our collective greed and the greed of those who have come before us. May we, in the various places where we live and serve, support our Indigenous siblings in their efforts for land and water protection and restoration, and for cultural healing and recovery, and commit ourselves to the work of challenging and ending systems of racism and colonialism that are designed to oppress and exploit others. And as we gather on this beautiful piece of land called Maple Hill, May we seek to adopt postures of humility, confession, and repentance, and commit to being in right relationship with our indigenous kin, with our more than human kin, and with the earth, our mother, our protector, and our friend. So now I'm glad to introduce Reverend Nicole Dieroff, who's the program director at the BTS Center, to share a little bit about our theme for this week.
Thank you, Alan. And it is so lovely to look out at this gathered room and to acknowledge our virtual friends. Thank you for being with us. My name is Nicole Dieroff, she, her pronouns, and you've been getting some emails from me likely. So I'm the one behind the emails. This gathering, the intentions behind this gathering is that we might create time for learning, respite, and community. So I hope each of you is able to access moments of learning, moments of respite, and moments of community. That is how we have framed the time. And this particular year, our theme is kinship, reweaving the great web of belonging. One of the places I've been turning to related to kinship is a series of books. This is actually one of 5, a series called Kinship, Belonging in a World of Relations. And the opening essay in this book invites us to think not about kinship as a noun, but about kinning as a verb. And so I think that's a piece of what we're about, is less of like achieving, boom, we got kinship, and more an ongoing process of kinning, working to be in kinship. And I'm just going to share with you, this collection is full of essays and poems. So I wanted to share with you to start one of the poems that's towards the back of the first book. It's called Kingdom Canticle by Art Goodtimes. Unclap your millennial gates and unhinge the heavenly armor, ye knights and bishops. The checkmate age of the sky gods gone. No more lords, melt old swords. Enough of kings and courts and bendicities. I don't know this word. Anyway, enough of them. Before the killing sieges, forget our species' royal fist. The orchard opens up its stores, each tree a throne, each peach a prince. Each kami kali spider queen freely spinning silk from out her own divine innards. Not caught in the web, but dancing the wind's harp. This rural canticle sung, yes, to raise praise on high, holy, 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 but also to dig deep below, to be embedded in the thick mud of the mystery. Enough of kingdoms. Instead, let there be kingdoms. The fungal kingdom, the floral kingdom, the faunal kingdom, where we hum the body's every bone in honor of the making and the yet unmade. All of us kin, co-creators in conversation. Mick Redeye says, with what shines and with those divine goddess rhizomes rooted in the deeper dark, where life springs full-blown from the spark of matter. Yes, name of the book again is, so the series is Kinship, Belonging in a World of Relations. This is the first book of 5 and it's titled Planet. The editors of this series, Gavin Van Horn, Robin Wall-Kimmerer, and John Hastarfer. Anyway, one more word that I might not pronounce perfectly. Excuse me.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And now I want to invite 3 readers up, and that is Reverend Wendy Evans, Reverend Jane Fields, and Reverend Jane Field, no S on the end, and Reverend Fred Small. Come on up.
The Holy One invites us to this place for learning, respite, and renewal. We've come from many places, and here we find ourselves gathered into this sacred community, together seeking to weave the great web of belonging.
Some of us have come from places near, from Hollowell and Gardner and Augusta, while others have traveled from the far reaches of Maine, from Rockwood to Machias to Kittery, from Portland and Pownell and Prospect, from Waterville, Waterford, Winthrop, Westbrook, and Wells.
From Peaks Island and Chesapeake Island, from Scarborough and Stonington, Chelsea, Chesterville, and Castile, from Noblesboro to North Yarmouth, from Wilson and Auburn, Lincolnville and Thomaston, from Falmouth and Freiburg, and many other parts of this state.
We hail from Hancock, Maine and Hancock, New Hampshire, from Londonderry and Littleton, New Hampshire too.
We made our way from Massachusetts, Boston, Brookline, Braintree, Amherst, Norwood, Shelburne Falls, from Somerville and Cambridge and Lexington.
From North Ferrisburg and Weybridge, Vermont, from New Haven, Connecticut, and Warren, Rhode Island, from New York, New York, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Evansville, Indiana, and Boulder, Colorado.
And even from faraway places like Montreal, Canada, and the Netherlands.
Here we are connected with online companions who are logging in from 20 states, from the East Coast, from the West Coast, from the Deep South and the Midwest, from the Desert Southwest and everywhere in between, as well as from several Canadian countries and the UK.
We come with connections to different watersheds and diverse spiritual traditions.
Our perspectives are varied and we carry different hopes. Here we find ourselves woven into this beloved community. For these 2 days, together, seeking wisdom and wonder.
We are many, but one, interconnected, woven together in one sacred kinship. All that is green and growing, from the tiniest shoot to the mighty oak. Every living creature, large and small, those that swim, hop, slither, fly, and walk, human and more than human.
With hearts open to wonder.
And minds open to wisdom.
And ears open to the Spirit's whisper. We begin. Here we are reweaving the great web of belonging.
I'll invite you now to turn your songbooks to page 8 as we will sing Restless Reaper.
We appear so discrete, so unitary, but we are not. If we could see our interconnectedness, I imagine it would look like a fabric, threads running between each of us and every person on whom our lives depend. Threads tracing the path from each of us to each non-human creature that interacts with our life. The food on our table, that tree that we smile at every morning, the birds that sing us awake. Still more threads traveling from each of those creatures to all of the creatures on which they depend, their pollinators, their food, the earthworms that till the soil in which they grow. And finally, there are the shimmering gossamer threads, spun of some gorgeous hue, running from each creature and each human to God.
Thank you, Andy, for those beautiful words, which Andy wrote, by the way, an excerpt from an article that she published recently in the Christian Century. It's my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning and tomorrow morning, Victoria Loers. Victoria Loers is a wild church pastor, an eco-spiritual director, and author of the beautiful and compelling book, Church of the Wild, How Nature Invites Us into the Sacred. And just a show of hands, how many of you have had a chance to read that book? Look at the hands. That's why you're here, right? Because of that great book. Victoria is co-founder of the Ecumenical Wild Church Network and founder of the Center for Wild Spirituality, which offers experiential earth-based programs such as Seminary of the Wild Earth, a year-long eco-spirituality intensive for those called to create a new story of reconnection. This fall, Victoria and others will be launching a new eco-spiritual direction certification program that integrates the wisdom of wilderness, any member of the natural world, the waters, the crow calling, the sun, into the process of spiritual companioning. Victoria has a couple of upcoming books, can't wait, one of which is going to be a field guide to wild church. And Victoria says she feels most alive when collaborating with mystery and kindred spirits to create opportunities for people to remember themselves back into intimate, sacred relationship with the rest of the living world. Victoria, we're so glad you're here, and we're looking forward to hearing from you today and tomorrow.
Listen for the living word of God. As you hear from the Christian tradition, the Gospel of John, the first chapter. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. The Logos was with God in the very beginning. Everything came into being through the Logos. Apart from that, nothing came into being. And what came into being through the Logos was life. And the life was the light of all people. The gospel of the beloved.
What a beautiful reading of that passage. Thank you. Thank you, Nicole and Alan, and so many of you, Liz, so many of you that have put your whole life work into this convocation every year. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Yes? Okay, I can pull it a little closer. How about that? I'm especially excited about the theme. Thank you for sharing that you got that that idea from that series. But this theme is so foundational for all that we're facing. And it's just a privilege to be standing here and looking out at a room full of what I would call edge walkers. People that are walking on the edge of what is coming, what is becoming, and what has been, and we're living in this liminal space together. I want us to begin by just looking around at one another and just taking in the reality of this moment in time, this gathering, this particular gathering that will never be repeated again, that you've all been called here and called online for some mystery that we're only a little bit aware of, but we've said yes to. So we're here to talk about our role in restoring kinship into the core of our worldview and our way of being, but not just to talk about it, but like Nicole and Alan have reminded us, but to solidify a commitment within our communities to do the hard work of stepping into that role that is inherently countercultural, because it's based on a worldview of kinship and compassion and reverent relationship with all that is, and that's not the dominant culture. So this group of people right here, all these people right here, we are the ones who have been called to do our part in this culture of disconnection, to actually do that work of reweaving the broken web of belonging. So in a culture that has forgotten, we are the ones, all of you are the ones who are remembering ourselves and the people in our circles back into sacred, reciprocal, and loving relationship with the rest of the alive world. We're the ones who know deep down that we are not separate from nature. We're the part of nature that comes in a particular human form and with our own particular interests and gifts and flaws and voices. And we're being called. We've been called, right? Anybody feel that calling? Yeah. We've been called by God, we've been called by Spirit. We've been called by the rainforest. We've been called by the deer. We've been called by the vast sky that's suffering invisibly with too much carbon. We've been called by our ancestors. We've been called by future generations. So remember this time when things get rough, and they will. Remember this time because you are not alone. You might feel like you're alone. You might have had this sense of that sacred connection your whole life, and you never really had the words to talk about it, to really embrace it. And so you've felt like maybe that part of you is just kind of has to keep separate. But this is a time of bringing that back, of knowing that that part of you belongs, and not only belongs, but is really desperately and actually urgently needed right now. Just this morning, I was sitting in the motel in the breakfast area, and it sort of felt like time in my life. There were 7 years where my son and I were sort of on the speaking circuit, only he was the speaker. He was kind of like Greta 15, 20 years ago. And so we spent pretty much all of his adolescence in motels like that, at conferences like this, at the UN, and in big conferences in schools, where he spoke to over 1 million people in his adolescence around the reality of the climate crisis and the need for his generation and all generations alive to step in and to do their part. And it was just bizarre. So every time I'm sitting in a hotel like that, in the breakfast room, and I'm looking around, so I was sort of feeling and remembering those days. And those days ended about, what, 15 years ago? But on the TV, I'm seeing something that looked just like his presentations. Literally this morning, it was on the news was the Swiss avalanche in 2 years had already lost 10% of its form. You know, there's the drought in Texas, the storms taking over the coast in Ireland as well, and then the flooding in Vietnam, all in a couple minutes. Like what was a presentation 15 years ago is now just day-to-day news. So all of us, and he would say at the end of all of his speeches, he would always say, now is the time to live as if our future matters. And all of us here know that we're standing on this threshold of all of these profound changes. Most of them will not be by our choice, but they are a result of our species' choices. And indirectly by our ongoing choices. The fact that I'm here and I took an airplane here. Now we're living with that incongruity, but we're also witnessing this slow motion collapse of an empire. Some kind of seismic shift is happening, and this fragile time of unraveling is happening before our eyes, in our culture, as well as on our planet. And it's a shift that's full of grief and loss and unknowing and reckoning. And with that unraveling, there's an emergence that's being embodied by people like you, who are willing to collectively stand in that unknowing together. No, it's like we're allowing the unfolding, mostly because we can't not. But we stand with one another through that undoing that actually needs to happen. And in that, we lean on one another and we listen more deeply to God, to the earth, and to one another. And so I love this title, Kinship, Reweaving, that web of belonging, because we're in this together, and the only way through is together. All of us, the human and the more than human, we need to listen more closely to the voices in particular that have been overlooked and dismissed and ignored or silenced. The voices of Indigenous peoples who have never forgotten our place in the web of belonging. The voices of women, the voices within the queer community, the voices from the Southern Hemisphere, the voices from religions outside of our comfort zone, the voices of the trees and the storms and the tiny viruses. So the wisdom that we need at this pivotal time in our history, that's where we're going to find that wisdom, in kindred relationship with all of those voices, which are all sacred. And by listening, I mean practicing kinship, engaging in relationship through authentic and respectful conversation and presence. To listen to the others with humility, knowing that we don't have the answers, and to hold on to the truth that this reweaving work that we've all committed to in our own ways is done only in kindred relationship. Because we've never actually left the web of belonging. Just through a long history of intentional disconnection through colonization and empire building, we have forgotten. Not all of us, though. Some of us have not forgotten. Deep in our hearts, we've not forgotten. People like John Bear Mitchell. He's here today to remind us that some cultures, despite being targeted and beaten down violently and dismissed, have never forgotten. Kinship is a worldview our Indigenous brothers and sisters still live by. Martin Luther King reminded our world that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And that the next part of that well-known phrase is, he says that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, which is another word for web of belonging.
Fannie Lou Hamer, a courageous civil rights activist from Rulesville, Mississippi, was arrested and beaten and kicked out of her home because she dared to register to vote in 1964. She's the one who said in 1971 to the Women's Caucus, as she pleaded to get white women to stand alongside Black women in their fight for freedom, she said, "Nobody is free until we're all free. A white mother is no different from a Black mother. The only difference is that they haven't had as many problems, but we cry the same tears, and under the same skin is the same kind of red blood." This is kinship. It's the recognition that we're all deeply interconnected, and what happens to one of us happens to all of us. It's an easy thing to say, but to live into that is the challenge that all of us have been given. Churches understand kinship. We talk a lot about belonging to one body, about family relationships, and we understand that it's no longer enough to be family only to your own family. What this moment is asking of us is to move beyond our church, our denomination, our religion as family, to move beyond people like me as family, to move beyond people who are human as family. Kinship is living as if our beloved community includes the whole alive and interconnected world. We're facing a barrier that's built by centuries old belief system of dominance. It's a worldview of separation that's opposed to every system of life. And it disconnects us from the sacred world by imagining that we're more important than everybody and everything else. And that system of thinking paved the asphalt road for the increasing climate crisis that we're experiencing. I think it's also connected with the increasing cultural crises and the polarities that we're experiencing. This worldview of disconnection. But what's less obvious, but equally dangerous about the climate crisis, is the psycho-spiritual consequences that are suffered by our own species. A spirituality that's rooted in a human superiority, like every other superiority, is nearly as dangerous for the dominant parties as it is for those that they other. We need to ask ourselves, what do our souls lose by forgetting that we're part of nature? What is atrophied within our spiritual reality by pretending that we are the only species who really matter to God? Thomas Berry, in The Sacred Universe, he says, the divine communicates to us primarily through the language of the natural world. Not to hear the natural world is not to hear the divine. He's pretty straightforward about it. And after 35 years that I've been in the church and in the environmental movement, focused on these issues, I can say with some urgency that the very real and concrete changes that our world desperately needs and desperately resists will not happen without a profound change of heart. What we need can't be legislated or litigated or explained or resolved through a great sermon or a brilliant activism campaign. Gus Speth, who started the NRDC, an attorney, an activist, a scientist, naturalist. He said something that's a few years ago, and many of you have probably heard this, but I just keep going back to it because it's so relevant to us in this room and in this virtual room as well. He said, I used to think that top global environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and a cultural transformation. And then he says, and we scientists don't know how to do that. And so I ask you, how many people here are pastors? How many people here are spiritual leaders? That's everybody else. It's all of us. Spiritual leadership in a climate change world looks different. It includes the church, but it's way bigger than that. It's infiltrating everything. This is our work. This is our work. He says, we scientists don't know how to do that. Do we spiritual people know how to do that? We're learning together. I spent 20 years in church leadership, and spiritual transformation was rarely, if ever, connected with actual cultural change that addresses these problems. I also spent 12 years as a nonprofit leader in the climate movement, where spiritual transformation in that movement was often just meant engaging more faith communities in our campaign. But it rarely meant developing a new way of life, directed by a spirituality that deepens relationship with the land and the waters and the species that we're seeking to protect. That's our work, spiritual leaders. The kindred reweaving of belonging isn't just like a very great meme. It'll be awesome on a t-shirt. It's an urgent call for reformation and renewal at this crucial moment in history. And you are the ones to bring it in your particular place, with your particular words, with your particular gifts. Thomas Berry talks a lot about a new story, the new story that's being written right now. And it's not going to be written in some, at some conference like this or at the UN or some brilliant writer. It's going to be written in a million different ways, in a million different places, led by people like you. 30 years ago, I researched and wrote a comprehensive worship toolkit to encourage churches to care for creation. That was the language we used back then to support a shift from a worldview of dominion that the church was guilty of into a worldview of dominion over nature, into a more acceptable stewardship of nature. And moving from dominance to stewardship has been important. All the work that we are continuing to do to be more mindful about our impact on the planet is absolutely essential. But now an even deeper spiritual reformation is needed and is happening. This is a move from stewardship into relationship. Moving away from a worldview of disconnection and a way of life that treats others, all others that aren't in the dominant party, as a collection of objects, whether it's human or more than human. To move away from that worldview toward a way of being human that participates honorably in a vast communion of subjects with whom we are in kindred relationship with. That's what Thomas Berry calls the great conversation. Here it is. This is what I was thinking about before. We are in trouble, he says, because we don't have a good story. We're between stories in that liminal space. The old story is no longer effective. We see that in every aspect of our lives. And yet we have not stepped into the new story quite yet. And the way to the new story, Berry says, happens by reconnecting with the rest of the world as a sacred relationship. Reconnecting, by the way, is what the word religion means. Ligios is like a ligament. Reconnection is what we do. Apparently, humans need a lot of reminders, because religion has been a central part of humanness for all of humanity. Berry says, we're talking, here's the problem, he says, we're talking only to ourselves. We're not talking to the rivers, we're not listening to the wind and the stars. We have broken the great conversation. And by breaking that conversation, he says in his subtle way, we have shattered the universe. Over the last 30 years, I've wrestled with this broken conversation as a pastor of indoor churches, which is what I call them now. As a climate activist, as a mother, and now as a guide who leads people in spiritual practices that reconnect them with the natural world as sacred. When I first started paying attention to our disconnected from nature, I wondered if this kindred reconnection was foreign to my religious tradition or not, as a Christian pastor. I'd been told that it was, that God was not in a tree, that worshiping nature was a pagan activity, that animism, which is the belief in an ensouled world, isn't Christian. The church and nature were polar opposites. So I kept my actual numinous experiences that I and most people, whether they're involved in a religious tradition or not, experience in nature. I keep that out of church. And then in the climate movement, I hid my religious connections. They were just two separate parts of who I am. So at a point about 10 years ago, I needed to dig beneath the layers of patriarchy and power that have distorted the wild message of the Christ of my tradition, to see if this duality of nature and spirit was inherently baked into Christianity or not. In my years of preaching for indoor churches, I would spiritualize wilderness as a metaphor for tough times or dark nights of the soul, those depressions and those disappointments and divorces and deaths that we all have to face eventually. But I came to understand that wilderness is more than a metaphor. I began to wonder what role the actual wilderness played in biblical stories. And it soon became clear to me that every single leader in both testaments were called into relationship with the wilderness at pivotal times in their own leadership development and at pivotal times in the world. God revealed God's self to Moses, not in the tabernacle ever, but in a bush, in the wind, at the top of a mountain. And the enslaved people escaping Egypt were sent into the wilderness, not the promised land, for 40 years. Hagar escaped the jealousy of Sarah in the wilderness. Elijah fled alone to the wilderness to escape Jezebel's pursuit. Jonah tried to run from his calling and was consumed by a wild mammal of the sea, then heard a clear message from a gourd plant that was shielding him in the wilderness. I kept looking. Job, Abraham, Isaiah, Joshua, Solomon, Hosea, Ezekiel, all of them were sent into the wilderness. John, Jesus, Paul, at pivotal moments in their lives and in their world, they were called into service first by being called into the wild. Why? Wilderness is a term used over 300 times in the Old Testament. I was at a wild church once, and a couple who were from Israel and spoke Hebrew were there. And they said to me afterwards, they said, you know what that word wilderness in the Old Testament, in ancient Hebrew means, don't you? And I was like, you know, the word is dabar. And I'm like, yeah, it means wilderness. And they said, no, the verb dabar, the word is ba midbar. That's the word used as wilderness over 300 times. And it's rooted in the verb dabar, which means speaking. Ba midbar means literally, if you look it up, if you look it up in the lexicon, the first definition is mouth, the organ which speaks. Second definition is wilderness. It's interesting that in all of our copies of the Bible, wilderness is 100% the translation that's used, and yet it's not the most common one for that word. But that was a moment for me, you know, like one of those feelings where your soul just shifts in an instant. I began to think of like, therefore I led them out of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness, midbar. And it shifted for me, rather than simply a harsh backdrop for some human drama, like I often portrayed the sight of those 40 years of Israel's wandering, to see the wilderness as a place that speaks with the voice of the sacred completely changes the tone of that whole story? What if God knows that there's simply no better way to rehabilitate from the effects of trauma than immersing in the wilderness? Seeing the wilderness as an organ of speech, the part of the body that the living earth speaks to us, transforms those stories from a harsh place of difficulty into a tender place of intimacy. Wilderness remains a refuge to listen to the voice of the sacred speaking straight to your bones, to remind you who you are. In the wild, remember that you belong to a greater story. For the Israelites who were kept captive under Egyptian colonization and slavery for more than 400 years, unlearning an identity of oppression and restoring a new character of belonging and purpose probably takes at least 40 years. So rather than a punishment, being sent to the wilderness becomes a provision, an opportunity for listening and deepening relationship. We are still being invited into this great conversation, into the sacred wild, listening to the land as a sacred voice and responding in kind. The ancient Greeks called it logos. 500 years before Jesus, logos was first used to describe, and I quote from Heraclitus, a divine reason implicit in the cosmos, ordering it, giving it form and meaning. Logos had this explicit sense that everything in nature is full of some kind of divine indwelling, worthy of reverence. Logos is similar to what the biologists now are revealing about the way trees talk to one another. It's a complex and emotionally alive relationship that the trees have underground with one another and with the whole forest. Logos is an ancient description of what the quantum scientists have discovered is at the center of all things. At the center of molecules aren't things, even though we call them nouns, pronouns, or protons and neutrons. But they've discovered that those aren't things, they're relationships. They're connected through various forms of conversation. So a few centuries after the death of Jesus, the writer of the Gospel of John used this familiar concept of logos as a culturally relevant way to understand the significance of Jesus in the context of Christ. And as our brother read this morning, in the beginning was the logos. Theologians and bishops who first studied the Gospel of John understood what the evangelist was trying to express, that logos was a relational force inherent in all things, holding together all things by relationship between. Logos was a good metaphor and description for the Christ and for the role that Jesus fulfilled in embodying the Christ. Logos existed before this inward divine dwelling existed before Jesus, was embodied by Jesus, and continues throughout all time. Logos happens through relationship, this act of conversing, this intimate abiding, turning to one another. It's like a sensual, living, flowing, and never-ending relationship that we are part of. The web of belonging. It's the original primal relationship that has existed throughout all of history and beyond that. And here's the interesting thing. Up until the 4th century, translators consistently translated that Greek word logos into Latin, which was the language of the church, as sermo, which means conversation. Sermo indicates not a one-way sermon, as it sounds like now, but it's a lively discourse. It's a dialogue. It's a relational manner of speaking back and forth. It means to weave or to join together. Sermo is the intimate living of life together, familiarity, intimate conversation, the act of living with. Sermo was the Latin translation that best fit the meaning of logos. Imagine that. In the beginning was the conversation, and the conversation was God. And the conversation was with God, and the conversation was God. The conversation was with God in the beginning, and all things that came into being did so through conversation. And apart from this, nothing came into being that has come into being. And the conversation became flesh and dwelt among us. Just sit with that for a second. Christ as an embodied, intimate reciprocity of giving and receiving, of listening and sharing vulnerably. Christ as the sacred conversation that brings all things into being and links all things together. It makes sense. Christ as love. In the beginning, the conversation created all things, and through conversation made all things new. It's not just a provocative religious image, it's actually a biological description of how life works. In the beginning was the conversation. We are part of an interconnected web of life, conversations going on at microscopic levels within our bodies, conversations happening within family systems, within societies, within and between species, within the biospheres where we all live. Conversations happening between the sun and the planets and the galaxies. And the conversation with God, suggesting that God is a dynamic intimacy of relationship, a verb of backing and forthing. Conversation, holding all things together from cosmos to nations, to ecosystems, to your own psyche. Practicing the presence of God is rooted in the very DNA of life. Makes you wonder what happened. I did. Why is this translation consistently translated for 3 centuries as thermo or conversation? Suddenly, you can't find a single Bible that lists, that calls it in the beginning was the conversation. And there's reasons. I won't go into all of it, but as I researched this, I found that it was a long history of patriarchy and mistranslation and empire that actively suppressed this translation for 1700 years. And so reviving it, I think, is an act of resistance. Something happened in the 4th century named Constantine, who was pretty hell-bent on being the one emperor. And so that idea of conversation with all of these diverse voices was not okay. And so at the Council of Nicaea, essentially a decision around that time was made, we're gonna translate this differently. And for years, there was a fight around this, a fight that the conversation lost. After all, allowing conversation to define the essence of Christ could encourage those dissenting voices to be heard. They had to be effectively shut down. Word was better. In the beginning was the word. There's no back and forth with word. There's no room for dissent. There's no changes, just the one and the only word, the last word, the capital W word, the inarguable word, the end of discussion word, the everybody else's word is heresy word. The hierarchy chooses word, and so it remains word, end of conversation. Imagine what one word change could do. Imagine what could happen if a spirituality defined by word of authorities transitioned into a spirituality guided by conversation within a living, interconnected, kindred world. If the imperial agenda of the powerful, by co-opting a religion for its own purposes, can have a centuries-long impact of violence and disconnection, what would a wild Christ be? A conversation which is the intermediary of love between all things. What could that evoke in our world? Is it possible for us to imagine the worldview of kingdoms and empires transforming into a world of kingdom and compassion, like the poem that Nicole read? Imagine how different life could be if Christianity could become a place for sacred conversation, a place to explore possibilities, express doubts, disagree, and encourage voices on the edges. Practices of kindred conversation and connection, like the ones that we're practicing here, can replace that human kingdom paradigm of hierarchy and inequality with the power systems of earth, which can be described as a kingdom of cooperation and kindred reciprocity. We've been born in a time that is one of those kairos moments, those moments where something happens, a decisive moment when our life. This is a kairos time of great urgency, and we need to remember our belonging in the web of interconnected sacred life. I was visiting a wild church in Sarnia, Ontario last year that was held in the longhouse of Ojibwa elder David Plain, the grandson of the chief in that region. And while tending a sacred fire, David shared with me and the rest of the people at the wild church his reasons for holding the services for a group of white people that are gathered there. He told of the 7 fires prophecy. You might know. He said, "It is this time, the 7th fire, that the light-skinned race will be given a choice between 2 roads. One road will be green and lush and very inviting. The other road will be black and charred, and walking it will cut their feet. If they choose the right road, then the 7th fire will light the 8th fire, the final fire, an eternal fire of peace, love, and kindred connection." This is our work, fellow spiritual leaders, embedded in the dominant culture. That's us. In relationship with all those who can help us choose the right road, our work is desperately and urgently needed. May we be agents of choosing the right road, of making the path straight on behalf of our whole family. Thank you.
Well, how about that? He gave us a few things to think about, I think. Victoria, thank you so much for that really compelling, challenging, and inspiring message. Such a great start to the great conversation that we are having over these 2 days. And the good news is this is just part 1 of a 2-part conversation, because we'll have some more time with Victoria tomorrow morning. And so we're grateful for that. We're going to transition into a continued conversation and widen the conversation a little bit and invite you all to maybe have a question that you'd like to ask. And again, today's not your only chance. We'll do this tomorrow as well. I'd invite you to think about that for a minute. Also want to direct your attention in the center of your table. You might have noticed some strips of colorful fabric, and you might have been wondering, what's that for? And to invite you to find one, and we're going to do some weaving while we're together over these 2 days. Over here on the right side of the room, just beyond Liz, is a loom, and it's just waiting for some weaving, don't you think? So what I would invite you to do, there's also should be some Sharpies in the middle of your table, and you're gonna have to share because there's not one Sharpie for each person, but now and over lunch and in the hours ahead, just think about what your prayer is. Maybe Victoria said something today that just kind of lit a fire within you, and there's a prayer that's rising up, or maybe prayer isn't your word, maybe it's an intention. Maybe it's an intention or a thought that you really want to hold on to. But you're not going to hold on to it, at least not tangibly. I want to invite you to actually take the Sharpie and write whatever it is on the piece of fabric. It might be just a word, a word. It might be a conversation. We're not doing words. It might be a conversation between yourself or a conversation between yourself and the divine. Write whatever might be meaningful on that strip of fabric. And then we're going to actually move the loom kind of closer where it's a little more accessible. And during lunch, we just invite you to weave. And you know how weaving works, right? The vertical part is called the warp, and this is called the weft. And you just kind of weave in and out. And we'll have to keep smushing it down, you know, because there's 100 of you. So yeah, we're just going to weave a little bit. So that's for you to do. I wonder if anybody has a question that's burning. I mean, I have a few on my piece of paper, but yeah. So Ben, are you going to be our Jerry Springer for today? Or who's the right?
Thank you for that description. It's so flattering.
Yes, maybe just say your first name over here, Ben. Maybe just say your first name. You're already with a question written down and everything. That's great.
I mean, it's written down in a way.
Tell us your first name.
Okay, my name is Shelby. I use the they, serious pronoun. You had talked about concrete change requires a change of heart. And that climate devastation is not just through the ways in which our world is like deteriorating our society is deteriorating the natural world, but also that it's through greed, apathy, and selfishness. And so I was wondering, what would you see as the opposite of those? So if you're trying to diminish greed, selfishness, and apathy, what are we trying to then recultivate? Something that they are in there somewhere. And like, how do you think about incentivizing that change?
Yeah,
Great question.
that is a great question. And, essentially the opposite of all those. Don Jacobs, 4 Arrows, has a book called Restoring the Kinship Worldview, where he goes through, some of the precepts of an indigenous worldview versus a Western worldview, which is, and they're essentially the opposite of each other. But I think, this is our work. This is it. And tomorrow is when I'm going to talk about more practical things. So I will talk about that more tomorrow. But it's really, how do we create spiritual practices that reconnect us with the rest of the world as kin? That's how and why I started Church of the Wild in 2015, is to start to experiment with that, to start to create those practices. And yeah, without going more deep, that's such a big question. I'll answer it tomorrow in a half an hour.
To be continued. Thank you, Shelby, for that great question, though. We talked about this from the Gus Beth quote that we recite all the time as well: cultural and spiritual transformation. Yeah, Desi Prita, you have a question?
I love that prompt, Shelby. Thank you. My name is Prita. Actually, could we even say there aren't opposites, and what might that be to be in kinship with empathy, greed, and selfishness, and hold these paradoxes to allow it not to feel separate?
Amen. That's beautiful.
Great reconnection.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
How would that look?
Right. Instead of, we're so dualistically oriented, to see that, the system, this is what Bayo Okumolafe talks about all the time, that the resistance to the current system is part of the system. And that's just how it works. Like, these aren't actually opposites that are polars, but they are in relationship with one another, and darkness cannot exist without light. Masculine and feminine, awake and asleep, darkness and light, like they go together, they're necessary. Exile and return. All of those are part of the story. And so you're absolutely right. How do we integrate and change our relationship with them, even as dualistic opposites? So thank you for catching that.
I love the interplay between those two questions, though, right? That reminds us there's always a deeper layer. There's always more texture. And if you're interested in exploring that, Rita's actually going to be leading an immersion session talking about paradoxes
There it
this afternoon and tomorrow from the Hindu tradition. Yeah. Is there another question in the room right now? I see way in the back. And we'll have time just maybe for one more question, and then we're going to continue the conversation.
I wanted to engage with beautiful language conversation that we're in, a kind of gift from the Jewish tradition at this moment. We're in this, we're poised in the Jewish cycle of the reading of what we call the Torah, we call the Old Testament. Last Shabbat, we read the last word of the Torah, and we're about to begin. And the very last word of the Torah is Israel, which means God wrestlers, and it refers to all people. It's a word that to me we could extend to this generous notion of kin. And in the very last letter of the word Israel, Islamic, and when you bring that letter to the very beginning, that very first moment when the word, the daber, comes in, it's bet and it spells heart. So there it is, you know, the pathway from our kinship, our kinship with all being to a new heart. We begin again with the new heart, from our broken heartedness to our wholeheartedness.
Beautiful. Thank you.
I'm so grateful to bring in another tradition. Can you just tell us your first name? Ilana, thank you so much. And just to be mindful that in this room, I know there's a whole lot of Christians, but there are also some people who are practice the Jewish faith, Hindu. I bet there are some Buddhists in the room, some atheists, some pagans, Unitarian Universalists, Quakers. Did I miss a tradition? Just name it. Okay, and lots of others probably, right? That don't fit in any of those categories.
Red Sox.
Red Sox. Definitely Red Sox fan. No, let's not get into that. Now you're meddling, Steve. But I wonder, just before we transition to some logistics and then lunch, I so appreciated the way you helped us to dig a little deeper into John 1, Christian scripture. I wonder if you have just a word for people in the room who may not. They have a word, a few words, a bit of a conversation for people in the room who maybe, you know, people have been wounded by the church. Church can be a really triggering word. Religious trauma is real. People in the room who maybe don't resonate with Christian scripture at all, but are here because this topic is so alive for them. Is there just a few words that you might want to say to that? Yeah, just to broaden it a little bit. Yeah.
I like the word edge walkers.
Yeah.
And I think the edge walking that I'm talking about, the people, you guys, the people that I think are drawn to this transition are people who have had mystical connection with the divine. And it doesn't, you know, at those who call themselves, or at least experience life as a mystic, connect with others in other traditions more often, often more than people within their own tradition. And so I think we are on that edge, you know, from all of the different traditions. We share this place together. We have different insights, different approaches, different ways of different words, different cultures to engage in the reality that we are all connected and that connection is sacred. And so it's not only a good thing, to have people from different traditions gathering together, but it's essential. You know, it's essential for us to listen to one another, to listen deeply to one another. And like I said, like especially those voices that the dominant culture has shut down. And so, you know, to make room for that, in your churches, in your relationships, in the conferences that you plan, in the events that you are hosting, to make room for that because we need one another.
Thank you, and to be continued.